This day is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states or situations. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. Welcome to the first dry January of 1920 at 12 a.m. or 12 and 1 second a.m. on January 17th, 1920, the Volstead Act kicked in, which meant the Prohibition came into force throughout the country. No more liquor for Americans. That was at 12 a.m., midnight. The first documented violation of the Volstead Act was recorded 59 minutes later in Chicago when thieves held up a freight train, stole about $100,000 worth of whiskey. So we tried, America. We tried to stop drinking.
We tried for 59 minutes. Come on, we got an hour.
That's the only official recording of that, right? But look, we've talked about the temperance movement a fair amount on this show, and I want to focus in today on those very first moments of Prohibition, the hours, days, weeks after the Volstead Act was implemented. America was basically trying to stick a finger in the dam that was holding back a river of alcohol. There are some wild stories in here. Here to discuss, as always, are Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
How would you have survived in those first days of Prohibition?
I would have been all right.
I know. I think I would have been just fine.
Kellie, you would have been a NASCAR bootlegging your way through the Appalachian
alcohol
Mountains.
has never been like my pleasure. I'm like more of a foodie, and like chocolate is my drug of choice. Like, so they put a ban on chocolate, we would have problems.
I will say, like, my family is German American, and we're the very people who were being targeted by Prohibition. So I suspect my ancestors might have had a little bit of a challenging time, or simply a series of workarounds for Prohibition.
Well, do you want to start talking about some of those workarounds?
I do want to talk about those workarounds.
They don't even start at 12:01. They start, people are prepping.
No. As you would, right? Like, if you know it's coming, if you know that something that you enjoy or possibly are addicted to is about to fly off the shelves and not be available anymore, you're going to have a contingency plan. And a lot of Americans did, particularly wealthy Americans, because you had all of these saloons and private clubs that had a lot of alcohol that starting at 12 o'clock and 1 second on January 17th, 1920, they weren't going to be able to sell anymore because the sale was forbidden. And so they had a kind of a going out of business sale, which a lot of wealthier Americans took advantage of. And a lot of people who understood that when you take something that people like and you make it illegal, people aren't going to stop liking it. They're going to find new ways to get it. And so the people who were preparing to sell liquor on the black market, they too were stockpiling so that they would have something to sell.
Yeah. Because if you had purchased alcohol before, you could consume it in your home legally. But you sort of, you couldn't get it anywhere else. You couldn't be out in public with it. And so people are basically stockpiling as much alcohol as they can possibly get. And that to me is just wild. Like, I think about the time.
Such a bad comparison, by the way, but it's like just the first week of lockdown where COVID, where people were just like, oh God.
That's what I was thinking. In the pandemic, people were like, get everything you need, get masks, get alcohol.
Well, and also...
I still have some hand sanitizer somewhere.
Not unrelated, but like get a prescription. Because that whiskey that got stolen an hour into Prohibition was quote unquote medicinal whiskey. And this was one of the carve outs of the Volstead Act, was that if you had a prescription for it, as Winston Churchill did, when he came to America, he was swilling whiskey left and right because he was like, I have a doctor's note. Yeah. So there were workarounds. Right. I mean, this is like medical marijuana, right? Yeah. It's your gateway.
Yeah. So there were workarounds, but then there were also sort of like loopholes in the law itself, right? So you mentioned, Kellie, you can drink what you have already in the house. There's a section 29 of the act allowed for 200 gallons of, quote, non-intoxicating cider and fruit juice to be made each year at home. But non-intoxicating was interpreted very liberally. Vineyards would start selling grapes for making wine at home. There was a grape concentrate called Vine Glow that was really popular before it was outlawed in 1931.
I think I just went blind just hearing that.
It sounds like something you'd clean your floors with. But there's 5,000 fatalities from poisoning at home. So you have, people's cultural habits aren't going to change. The law itself has all sorts of loopholes and gaps in it. And then the kind of enforcement of it was, to put it generously, lax, if not kind of willfully bad.
It was a joke. I mean, they had 134 agents that were meant to patrol all of Iowa, Illinois, and parts of Wisconsin. It's like, there's no way you are going to enforce that kind of sort of widespread, rampant, illegal activity. There's just no way. And then even when they do try to enforce it and people are arrested or there's a trial, for the most part, I mean, people are pretty much acquitted. There's not too many people that are going to jail or prison for, drinking alcohol.
I love this. Jury nullification is rampant during this period. People are getting caught. They're going on trial, and the juries of their peers are like, God, we'd do it too. Or probably we are doing it too.
Yeah,
and
not guilty.
have no interest in finding these people guilty.
Yeah.
All right. I want to kind of take a step back from the specifics of what went down here and talk about two things. One, I want to talk about kind of our relationship with alcohol now, which I think is really fascinating. But before we do that, do you have thoughts about, we've touched on Prohibition on the show before, we've touched on the temperance movement on the show before, but do you have thoughts about the temperance movement? It was a genuine movement, right? It had actual kind of, over decades and decades, built support. So it's not like this law came completely out of nowhere. And so I'm just fascinated by the idea that there was this genuine cultural movement that was real grassroots organizing that led to kind of a both cultural shift and then a political act, but then it also backfires in a way. And so, where does it go wrong? Why does a Volstead Act not kind of align with what was genuinely a grassroots cultural movement?
I mean,
I know that's a very complicated question.
I would, and I could be very wrong about this. This is just, I feel like this is the orals question that I would get in grad school. But when I think of the temperance movement, especially in the 1820s and 30s, I think of it alongside of other movements that are happening too, like the abolitionist movement. I think of it alongside the Great Awakening, this religious revival that's going across the country, and people are trying to get their house in order, so to speak. There's a huge push for morality and to sort of distance yourself as far away as you can from things like slavery, things like alcohol. Sin in general is uncool. There's this way of getting people to feel shame and guilt about this culture of debauchery. And I think alcohol gets thrown in with that. And partly because it's so widely available and accessible, that it's one of the few things that people, could get access to quite cheaply. And yet it does tend to wreak havoc.
Folks, I have very good news to deliver right at the top of the new year. That's right, it is 2025 and the great Alex Goldman is back with a new podcast called Hyperfixed right here on Radiotopia. Isn't it nice to get good news to start a new year? You know Alex, right? You know Alex. I've actually known Alex for a long time, going all the way back to when we were at WNYC together. He worked on the media, I worked in the newsroom. He went on to make the legendary and much beloved podcast Reply All, and now all is right with the universe because Alex is back with a new show on Radiotopia. Some things just make sense. So, what is Hyperfixed? Well, it's a show in which Alex and his team try to solve problems for their listeners. No problem too big, no problem too small. What's that mysterious button do? Why do the big coolers at grocery stores not have doors on them? Should I have kids or not? Along the way to answering these questions, Alex takes you on a journey to uncover the hidden systems and rabbit holes that help explain how we got here. And if you know Alex's work, you can rest assured that there is some vintage Goldman grumpiness along the way. Seriously, when we say that Radiotopia is the home for the most original audio makers in the world to try their ambitious new projects, this is what we are talking about. So, help welcome Alex Goldman to Radiotopia. Rejoice in an excellent new show to add to your rotation. It's called Hyperfixed. Hyperfixed. Check it out right now, wherever you get your podcasts. Look, I know it's a bit of a cliche to make a New Year's resolution to save more money. Probably even more of a cliche that resolution rarely gets kept. Honestly, I don't know when you're listening to this, but chances are I have already broken like 4 of my New Year's resolutions. But the saving more money one, it has been a lot easier for me thanks to Mint Mobile. I switched over to Mint Mobile's premium wireless service a couple months ago, and it has put some real wind in my sails going into 2025. Because their plans start at just $15 a month when you purchase a 3-month plan. Switching over from one of the big 3 carriers was incredibly easy, and boom, just like that, saving. I'm on my way. You can be on your way to fulfilling that resolution to spend less. To get this new customer offer and your new 3-month unlimited wireless plan for just $15 a month, go to mintmobile.com/thisday. That's mintmobile.com/thisday. Cut your wireless bill to $15 a month at mintmobile.com/thisday. $45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 a month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited plan. Additional taxes, fees, and restrictions apply. See Mint Mobile for details.
And a big part of this was that in the 19th century in particular, this was a women's movement. Women who didn't have access to the ballot were using these social movements and organizations in order to express their political citizenship. And so they're lobbying for things like they're lobbying for abolition, some of them were lobbying for slavery, but they're lobbying for temperance. So they weren't actually calling for a prohibition of all alcohol at first. They were just calling for less of it. And the idea was that, first of all, women were sort of valued for their morality. So that was kind of the cultural chip that they had to play when it came to politics. But also, they believed that the ills of society were rooted in alcohol and drinking too much, right? It brought violence into the home. It made workers more lethargic. It brought violence into the streets. If you could just stem the tide of alcohol, then you could solve all of these other social problems. And so it was this really progressive movement that then gets, in some ways, taken over by male politicians in the 20th century. And that's how it gets hardened into prohibition. But again, like it's a constitutional amendment. This was very popular. Until it went into effect. And then people were like, well, but we're not going to follow the new law.
But that intersection of kind of morality, culture, and grassroots organizing, and then sort of political change is so fascinating. And I think, I'm thinking about that kind of dynamic a lot now as we're kind of faced with all these big sort of rots that feel like moral rots, and then a recognition, I don't know if the temperance movement is exactly the best place to look. I think the abolitionist movement is probably a better place to look, but it's like grassroots organizing, small groups, community efforts, like that stuff is how you build back and actually change these big intractable problems. And it's fascinating to me that the temperance movement kind of serves as a model of that, even though it kind of then backfires when this constitutional amendment gets popped in. We don't have to talk about how it gets undone. I think we've touched on that a little bit. Obviously, it is undone. This country loves to drink. It has continued to love to drink, though that may be changing a little bit recently. So I don't know. Do you have any thoughts as we wrap up here about dry January, about, a very clear move, especially with younger generations, away from alcohol?
I love a good mocktail. Love a good mocktail.
Dry January, by the way, maybe in 1942, Finland told its citizens not to drink alcohol in order to preserve resources for the war effort. I would have picked another month other than January in Finland.
No kidding.
But nevertheless, that was like early dry January. But it's really like since like 2013 in the UK is kind of where people pin the origins of dry January. So it really is a relatively modern phenomenon of the last 10 years or so. And it ties into, as I was saying, this larger push away from drinking.
Yeah. I mean, the public culture of intoxication in the UK may be part of the reason why it starts there. I mean, I think dry January in some ways was a response to what is in the UK, I think, even bigger of a social problem than the U.S. I think that it takes off in the U.S. in part because of the expansion of wellness culture in the United States, like the understanding or the public embrace of the idea that alcohol, while fun, has some really negative health consequences that can get in the way of all of these other goals that people make in January, whether it's around weight or sleep or just overall health. And so people are like, well, I'm going to take this kind of finite period of time to reset my relationship with alcohol. And you get that at the same time that you're starting to see, I think for those same reasons, a drop in the number of people who are consuming alcohol. I mean, teenagers, and this is self-reported data, so it's hard to know, but like teenage consumption of alcohol has gone from like maybe 70% of teenagers reporting that they drink down to well under 50%. So there is a decline in consumption that is happening.
I mean, this was like maybe a couple of weeks ago in the Times, they were talking about weight loss drugs and how they have actually stemmed alcoholism, that the things that people sort of crave, alcohol is off that list, that once you're taking these different kinds of medications, you don't want alcohol. It actually doesn't taste good to you anymore. And a lot of other sort of addictive, like sugary, high sweet, high fat content things are no longer desirable. And so, I don't know. It's going to take a long time to see like what the results of that will be over time, but that's another issue.
So I personally feel the sort of deleterious effects of alcohol, and I've cut back my consumption a fair amount. Surgeon General just sort of came out and basically said like, this is very bad for you. We might end up soon having those kind of like same kind of labels that you would have on cigarettes that you would have on alcohol. There's another dynamic here, though, that I have been thinking about, and I'm borrowing this a little bit from a friend who I had a conversation with just this week. But there's part of me that wonders if it's not just about health and wellness, but, you know, this country, and especially younger generations, suffers from a real loneliness epidemic. And people are more isolated from one another. And people are staying at home and looking at devices, and, you know, the numbers of friends you have has been declining, you know, rapidly as with younger and younger generations. And there is part of me that wonders if the decline in alcohol consumption is a little bit of a sign of loneliness and isolation, you know? And there's part of me that's like, actually, get out there and have a couple drinks with friends. Like, we need that, you know? We need people to connect with each other and commune with each other and do stuff together. And so as much as I feel like, yes, be healthy, it might be a symptom to me of another much deeper kind of rot that's happening right now. So I don't know.
I want us to do like an entire episode on something like bowling alone or something like that to talk about this, because I have a lot of thoughts. But I actually do think that this is part of it, right? That part of people's alcohol consumption is a communal experience, for good or for bad, right? But it's going to the bars, and you see it in the ways that like going to the bars used to structure people's social lives. I'm thinking of those charts of how people meet their romantic partners. And
happy hour.
Prior to the social acceptance of online dating, bars was a big part of that. It was like work, school, bars. And online dating has replaced almost all of that. And I think that when going to happy hours and bars stopped being part of the way that people met in real life, then it wasn't prioritized in the same way, because you weren't getting, you know, it was seen as an opportunity to meet a romantic partner, a sexual partner. And if it's not that, why go?
Yeah.
Okay. One last thing, that anytime this kind of stuff comes up around, the decline of alcohol consumption and the sort of rise of non-alcoholic beverages, which, you know, I drink an Athletic from time to time. I like that. Athletic, if you're listening. There you go. We'll feel free to sponsor the show.
Us. Yep.
But to give an example of how twisted all these things and how backwards sort of you know, capitalistic incentives are in this market. Have you seen that there are now 0% proof hard seltzers?
Oh, yes.
So that's just seltzer.
That's just seltzer.
I was like, wait a second.
Yes, but that's how sort of twisted we are, that there was this hard seltzer boom, but now there's this no ABV boom, and so now they are marketing.
It's 0%.
It's 0. So they have like, you can buy like 0% White Claw. which
What?
I think is just seltzer. Though that's very funny when you read in press releases or articles, the White Claw people try and kind of like argue that it's not, that it's actually different from just regular seltzer. But I love just how kind of at cross currents all these incentives
it's
are.
Like
right?
a caffeine-free, zero ABV Four Loko.
Yeah, exactly.
At a certain point, you're like, what are we doing?
The marketing is magical. Yeah. Like the marketing will make you feel like you were doing something. So I get it. But I do, I mean, like there is something about like, I've just been enjoying mocktails and like the different ways you can mix like different juices and things of that nature, cucumber and lavender and all of that stuff. And I'm like, ooh, this sounds so exciting. Like there's something about how you present a drink that makes it, I think, appealing as opposed to, you know, here's a beer.
Yeah.
This has been one of the greatest things about the craft cocktail boomlet has been that it has actually led to a craft mocktail boom in a way that I think has really, enriched people's going out experiences, especially as people drink less and less actual alcohol.
Yeah, I think that's right. All right, well, we will leave it there. Raise a glass of whatever you want to drink. I think we approve mocktails here. We also approve go out, have a beer or two with friends.
Have some wine.
Have some wine. Fight the loneliness epidemic. Do what you can.
Yes.
But yes, we will leave it there. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.